Yes. Okay, let me introduce our next speaker. She obtained her PhD degree at the University of Münster in Germany, and now she is a junior research group leader at Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. Her research interests include numerical homogenization and multiscale methods, time harmonic wave propagation, and quasi-linear PDEs. So to talk about numerical homogenization approaches for nonlinear problems, let us welcome Dr. Barbara Verfürth.
Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction, and also thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak here. Please interrupt me if at any point my internet connection is too bad to listen to me. You should be able to see my screen now, and as announced, I'm talking about numerical homogenization approaches for nonlinear problems today. So the talk will be about the fusion kind of multiscale features and nonlinear features that you can encounter in various problems in material science, physics, and engineering. And I've brought to you a typical multiscale coefficient that I'm thinking of in this talk here. So for example, so especially I don't assume anything like periodicity or scale separation. It's can be completely random in this sense. And as you've learned in this week, especially in the course of Daniel Petersheim, this typically means that the standard finite element discretization does not produce good approximations if you do not resolve all the variations and jumps of this coefficient. On the other hand, resolving all these variations of the coefficient is prohibitively expensive because it can mean a lot of degrees of freedom and large linear systems. Apart from that, as I said, multiscale meets nonlinear. So in many cases, you have some picture like this, where you have on the x-axis some physical quantity and on the y-axis the related material property. And in certain regimes, you can well model it with a linear constitutive law, not a linear response law. But if you come typically to something like high intensities, high stresses, you have to use a nonlinear model for this. And I will introduce the model problems we are looking at in a second, but let me already stress that they are posed in situations that cannot be put in the framework of I have a linear problem and then some small or compact nonlinear perturbation, so like a small deviation from the linear case. And because we're not in this setting, there are several new challenges in the numerical analysis. And especially these challenges come into play if we want to combine both worlds, the multiscale world, which is quite well understood in the linear case, and the nonlinear case, which in some sense is quite well understood if you do not have rapid variations, but the combination of both. This is a huge challenge that we want to partially tackle in this talk. So with this, let me come to a rough overview of today's talk and today's results. It will be mainly split into two parts. In the first part, we will look at nonlinear monotone problems of the following forms. So this is like the nonlinear generalization of an elliptic or diffusion type problem, where you have a nonlinearity in the gradient. And there I will explain to you how you can a priori build up a fixed multiscale space that you can then use to solve this nonlinear problem in a discrete way. In the second part of the talk, we will look at the nonlinear Helmholtz equation that you see down here, where we have a cubic type nonlinearity in the lower order term here. And because the wave number k can be large, this nonlinearity, in fact, can be very dominant. I will explain this in more detail later on. And for this type of equation, we take a different perspective, a different route. We first apply the iteration scheme. So something like Newton's iteration, fixed point iteration. And then in each iteration step, we have to solve a linear problem where we quite well know how to construct the multiscale spaces. So this leads to iterative multiscale spaces, and I will also introduce some adaptive updating procedure in this context. So you don't need to understand all the words here. I will explain these techniques during my talk. So let me start with the nonlinear monotone problems, where I want to give you a glimpse at the following work that you can find as a preprint on arXiv, and that will be hopefully soon published within IMA journal on numerical analysis. So there you can find more details, more numerical experiments and all the proofs. We're looking at the following model problem in a variational form. We seek a weak solution U in H10 of the following problem, where the left-hand side will in the future be abbreviated by this calligraphic B. We have a right-hand side F in L2, and we have a nonlinearity depending on the spatial variable X and this nonlinear vector here, this vector here. And with respect to the spatial variable, we only assume L infinity regularity, and implicitly we think of multiscale variations in A, as you've seen on the very first page. To this vector, so the gradient, we assume a little more regularity, namely C1 regularity. And additionally, we assume Lipschitz continuity in the second argument, and a condition which is called strict monotonicity. And this kind of replaces the coercivity or uniform ellipticity assumption of the linear word. And then a final technical assumption that if you evaluate at 0, and that we are uniformly bounded in X. And this is and these are typical assumptions for this problem, under which you also know that that there exists a unique solution. And let me now come to the multiscale method in the spirit of the localized orthogonal decomposition that you've already got to know during this week. And I use the following notation. VH is a lowest order finite element space. So think of linear finite elements, these head functions, on what I call a coarse grid, meaning a grid that does not necessarily resolve the variations, the multiscale variations of A. And then you've also learned this. We have IH, stable quasi-interpolation operator, which projects H10 functions onto the finite element space. So I also assume that it is a projection. And then this induces the splitting of H10 into the finite element space and this W space, the kernel of IH. And you've learned that we think of W functions as being kind of fine scale and oscillatory, and VH functions as being coarse scale. And you've learned in the linear case how to set up a different splitting of H10 with this kernel space W and a multiscale space that was, and the splitting was orthogonal with respect to the energy product of your problem. So let us take this route as a first step and look how this what this yields in the nonlinear world. So this is what I call transfer of the linear LOD. So this means that we seek a solution, a multiscale solution in some space. I will come to this in a moment. A solution of the following discretized Galerkin type problem with this multiscale space as ansatz and also as test space. And then if you simply write down the linear LOD, this multiscale space would be defined as the finite element functions minus some corrections, where this correction operator Q, in Daniel Petersheim's talk it was a C. You will have to live with this slightly different notation now. And this correction operator Q maps from VH to W, and we've seen that it's a projection onto W with respect to this calligraphic be this problem form. But now I want to recall to you that this, in our case, this calligraphic B here was nonlinear in the first argument. So this automatically means that this operator Q is a nonlinear operator. And this also entails that this multiscale space is not a typical linear vector subspace, but it's some nonlinear object. And all in all, this formulation, this transfer from the linear LOT has several drawbacks. First of all, nonlinear coupling, you would have to study very carefully whether all this formulation makes sense, is well posed in any case. Then, if you think of the procedure for the linear LOD, the truncation of this correction operator is not clear in the nonlinear case, because you cannot, this relies on linear arguments. And finally, even if all these things could be overcome, I think personally that this coupling of a nonlinear coarse scale problem here and nonlinear correction problems, fine scale problems, may be very costly. And this all motivates us to take a different route here, and especially we will consider a different construction of these correction operators. So this leads me to the linearized multiscale method. So still we seek for a multiscale solution UHMS in a slightly different space now, which we use as our test and ansatz space to solve this nonlinear coarse scale problem. So the nonlinear coarse scale problem has only a changed test and ansatz space. It's still a finite element space minus some corrections. These corrections still map from VH to W, but now they solve linearized elliptic corrector problems. Namely, these correction operator Q is a projection onto W with respect to a bilinear form calligraphic A that is written out here. So this is a typical elliptic bilinear form. The question that remains at this stage, of course, is how do we choose, I simply wrote it down, how do we choose this fractal A, this diffusion coefficient here? And this is a very subtle question, because you know that a lot of the good approximation properties of this multiscale method rely on the fact that this correction operator entails information about the problem itself by a projection with respect to the energy product. So the question is, how do we choose this fractal A here, since we cannot, in this nonlinear world. And we do this by linearization. So here's the linearized multiscale method again. And we fix a linearization point, a function U star in H10. I will come to the selection of U star in a few moments. And then we have different possibilities for defining fractal A that are motivated by standard typical nonlinear iteration schemes and related to linearization procedures. The first choice is a Newton type choice, where you choose fractal A as the Jacobian of A with respect to the second variable. Recall that A was C1 with respect to the second variable. So you compute this Jacobian and you simply insert the gradient of U star. Another fixed point or a Kachanov type linearization is if you can write A of X nabla U in the following form, that you can pull out the nabla U in some sense. Then you can say simply freeze the nonlinearity in this alpha here, and you set fractal A to be alpha evaluated at the gradient of U star. And if you write things down, you will notice that both choices lead to the standard localized orthogonal decomposition in the case of a linear function A. So, so this choice is consistent, This is the route we will take. And this has now the big advantage that the correction problems that we have to solve are standard linear elliptic problems. So this Q operator is very similar to the C operator of the lecture of Daniel Petersheim, and especially we know how to localize it. And as you've seen this localization in the lecture, I do not want to go into the details once more, but let me recall that, let me simply say that we can localize Q to some Qm, so it was CL in Daniel Petersheim's talk, as in the linear case, and we have the exponential decay and so on as shown by, for example, these people. So the localized method now wants to find UHM in the multiscale space VHM, which is finite element functions minus these localized corrections of the finite element functions. And we use this multiscale space in a Galerkin formulation, so as our ansatz space for the solution and also as our test space. And then we simply write down the Galerkin formulation of the nonlinear problem. So UHM is the solution of a nonlinear problem. It's this calligraphic B here again. This nonlinear problem is now of a low dimension, and you can solve it with any method you like to solve nonlinear discrete problems, Newton type, iteration, or whatsoever. And because of the linearized correction operator, you can build up a basis for this multiscale space at the very beginning of your algorithm and then run your nonlinear iteration without touching this multiscale space at any point. We also have an estimate, so for the error between the exact solution and this multiscale solution in the energy norm, which is here the H1 semi-norm, which reads as follows. So have a linear convergence in the mesh size, the typical exponential convergence in this parameter m here. So these are the two terms that you maybe recall from the localized orthogonal decomposition in the linear world already. And you have the data term, so the L2 norm of f here. So you have linear convergence up to some additional term, which is a linearization error. And how does this look like? It's the difference between the correctors that we use in the method minus something like ideal correctors in the sense that they are the corrector operators computed with respect to fractal A U. So the linearization, if you take U star equal to U. So if you would compute your fractal AU and your correctors with respect to the exact solution, then you don't have a linearization error, of course. Of course, you cannot do this because you just want to find an approximation to this exact solution. But this theorem and this linearization error gives us a hint at how to evaluate different choices for U star. And this is what I want to discuss next. So possible choices of U star, what can we do, and what did I do in the numerical experiments that I want to present you in a moment. So the first thing that you can do, kind of a no-brainer, is you have to pick a starting value U0 for your nonlinear iteration for this problem anyhow. So you can simply take this U0 also as your linearization and then compute everything. And then this theorem here tells you that you will obtain a good properties if you had a quite good guess of the exact solution already. So this should be compared also with something like the local convergence of a Newton type method. Another idea that you can have is to compute a finite element solution on this coarse mesh. So on the mesh size capital H, you've seen that this UH is typically not a good approximation of U itself, but you may think, okay, it already entails some information about the problem and the right-hand side, so maybe it's better choice than simply guessing U0. So this is something that you can do, and that is quite cheap. And the next step that you can do is what I call a cascade of LOD solutions, which means that you pick some initial linearization point U star, then you compute such an UHM once, then you feed this approximation in as your new linearization and do this procedure once more. And of course, you can do this as often as you would like. And the hope is that because this UHM entails good information about you, that at every new cascade, you will probably have a better linearization point. And this is also actually what we will compare on the next, in the following. So for the numerical experiment that I present here, I chose a periodic spatial multiscale feature that you see here on the left. The results are not limited to this. It was just the easiest case to consider it here. And we have the following nonlinearity here. We have oscillations on the scale 2 to the -5, and we have a source function f, which is some Gaussian centered around the middle of the unit cube. And you see the values of u here, they go up to above 1 and are 0 Dirichlet boundary conditions. So the scaling of f was in such a way that we have some order 1 contributions of u here to have at least some gradients, because if the gradients are very small, then your nonlinearity will not have such a big effect. And so first, let me look at the theorem. So without considering different linearizations of U star, but with concentrating on this first part, on this convergence in the mesh size and the oversampling parameter. So you see here the relative errors in the H1 semi-norm for different choices of M, and then here on the x-axis reading from right to left, with decreasing mesh size. And for comparison, I also computed the finite element solution on the corresponding mesh, and you see that it does not resolve the variations of the coefficient and therefore is a very poor approximation. On the other hand, for m equal 2 or 3, we have a nice linear convergence almost throughout the whole process. And now we want to, and this was computed with U star equals 0, so with a simple linearization at 0. And now we want to compare different choices for U star. So we fix m equal 3, and then in blue you see exactly the curve from the left, so the linearization at 0. And then in green and in black, you see two different linearizations that both lie in the standard finite element space. One is the standard finite element solution, and the other one is the interpolation of the LOD solution. Recall that this lies in the finite element space as well. And you see that you do not win with these choices because apparently because the finite element space does not give you the right information. And you see not a big difference between green and black as well. What you see, though, in red is that if you first compute an LOD solution with linearization at 0, and then feed it in as your new linearization point and compute an LOD once more, then you obtain a better result. And you obtain a better result with nice linear convergence. And you should think that somewhere here is the target regime of our mesh sizes. And this cascade, this indicates that cascades of LOD solutions may have a benefit and reduce your linearization error. And this is also the motivation to look in the next step at something similar, but here we, in the cascade of the LOD solution, we would proceed as follows. We would first fix a linearization, do one complete run through to the nonlinear iteration, and then update the multiscale space, do another nonlinear iteration. And in the next part of this talk, I want to do the update of the multiscale space already during my nonlinear iteration. And this is something that I want to illustrate at the example of the nonlinear Helmholtz equation and its joint work with my colleague Roland Meyer from Chalmers University of Technology and University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And you can find details on this work in the following archive paper. So let me first again introduce the model problem. We look at the Kerr-type Helmholtz problem when we want to find the solution U in H1 of the following variational problem, where again, the left-hand side is abbreviated by calligraphic B. It's a gradient type term with a multiscale coefficient A. And this overbar over V denotes the complex conjugate. Then you have the wave number K, which is allowed to be large, a linear term with a multiscale coefficient N, and a cubic type nonlinearity, where epsilon is also a multiscale coefficient that is not necessarily small. So I know in this multiscale community, when you see epsilon, you always think of something small. This is not the case here. And this nonlinearity is acting on a compact subset of the whole computational domain. This is just to ensure that you don't get into troubles with your boundary condition. And as boundary condition in the Helmholtz problem, we have the simplest first order absorbing boundary conditions, the Robin type boundary condition. This is why we have a boundary contribution here with imaginary number I and wave number K. And we have again a right-hand side F on L2. And I've stressed now several times that the wave number K can be large, and then this semi-linear term can become dominant. And how does this express itself? For example, if you leave out the nonlinearity for a moment, so if you set epsilon to 0 for a moment, it was shown by Daniel Petersheim and co-workers that if you want to construct a localized orthogonal decomposition for the linear Helmholtz problem, it's not sufficient to correct us with respect to this elliptic part here, but you have Helmholtz problems for your correction operator, so you need to use this part with K as well. And this is also the case. This means also that we cannot simply neglect the nonlinearity in the construction of our multiscale space for the nonlinear Helmholtz problem, because we then expect to have a large error if we simply neglect it. And I've already mentioned several times that in the for the first part of the talk, we had a fixed multiscale space that we computed a priori and then did a nonlinear iteration. And that now I want to consider first an iteration scheme. It will be a fixed point iteration. And then in each step where I have to solve the linear problem, I want to construct the multiscale space. So let me first introduce how the fixed point iteration looks like for this problem. You pick some U0, and then your Uj is defined as the solution of a linear Helmholtz problem, denoted by this calligraphic B lin, which is the sesquilinear form from before. And for the nonlinearity, you insert this fixed function that is given as the first argument here, the phi. So if you want to compute Uj, you fix your nonlinearity at the previous iterate Uj minus 1, and you compute the solution of a linear Helmholtz problem. And under suitable assumptions on K, N, epsilon, and F, you can in fact show that on this continuous level, the sequence Uj converges to the exact solution U, because you have a fixed point contraction iteration. And this is why you can choose this fixed point iteration also in a or why it suggests to use this fixed point iteration also in a discrete setting. And there we now define a sequence of multiscale solutions UJHM in a special space that I will explain in a minute. And then again, this UJHM is defined as the solution of our linear Helmholtz problem in a discrete Galerkin type setting, so with test and answered spaces as multiscale spaces. And how is this multiscale space constructed? It's again the finite element space minus localized corrections. And these localized corrections, what is important is not the exact form, this is standard LOD, but in these linearized corrections QM, they are computed as solutions of a projection with a linear Helmholtz problem at the function phi, so in fact at the previous iterate. So in the jth iterate, you first have to compute the correction operators using the previous iterate. And then you can, again, using the previous iterate, solve a linear Helmholtz problem with your multiscale space. So this in particular means that you have to compute the multiscale basis, or the basis function in each iterate completely anew. And the computation of these correction operators can become quite expensive. So doing this in every iteration step is maybe not the best choice. The idea now is to not completely discard this approach, but to make it more efficient. And the idea is, because these correction operators can be split into local contributions, you only need to update the correctors in parts of the domain where the nonlinearity has changed from one iteration step to the next. So where this UJHM changes a lot. And typically, you will not have big changes from one iteration step to the next in the whole domain. And thereby you can save a lot of computational work. And this is what is shown on the next slide. I will just give you the idea of it. So we now have a sequence of multiscale solutions U tilde-JHM that are again defined as solutions of linear Helmholtz problems linearized at the previous iterate in a multiscale space consisting of the finite element functions minus some corrections. And these corrections are now locally defined as follows. You have either the case that you compute them anew, as on the previous slide, so taking the previous iterate and computing this correction operator by solving local Helmholtz problems, or you simply use the correction operators that you have at hand from the previous iterate. And the decision on each element, whether you update or do not update the correctors, is based on a local error indicator that I do not want to give you in detail here, but basically it measures the difference between U tilde J minus 1 and U tilde J minus 2 on a local patch. So a local error indicator and then standard adaptive thing, into your algorithm, you feed in a tolerance toll, and if the local error indicator is smaller than the tolerance, this means that you don't have to update because the error is small, and if it's larger than a tolerance, then you update. And for this adaptive iterative multiscale method, we have the following theorem, where we compare these U tilde JHM with the continuous iteration, UJ. Again, in the energy norm, which is an H1 norm where the L2 term is weighted with K. And then you can show that this energy error converges linearly in the mesh size exponentially in this parameter M. This is what you know from the standard LOD as well. And then we have some we have the tolerance in here again, because we don't update the correctors in every step. So if you would update the correctors in each step, this means tolerance equals 0. You a linear type error here, but simply the standard convergence. And let me illustrate this in a numerical example to conclude. So we have the right-hand side is an approximate point source. We have a nonlinearity acting somewhere here in the lower part. You can see in this reference solution this influence here, because you have not a perfect kind of circle here. We have variations of a, n, and epsilon on the scale delta to 2 to the minus 7. These are the intervals. The values of a, n, and epsilon are taken off. That's not so important, it's just for completeness. And we have a wave number k equaling 70. And then let me first concentrate on the left picture, which shows for different mesh sizes. First of all, the relative energy error of the finite element solution. You see that it does not resolve the variations, and therefore is a rather poor approximation. Then in green, you see something which is denoted as LOD infinity, which means that we take the approach of the first part of this talk, that we once compute a fixed multiscale space with a linearization around 0 in this case, and then use it for the whole nonlinear iteration. As you could expect from the first part of this talk, this already gives a better approximation and even better than linear convergence in this case. But if you do this adaptive procedure from this part of the talk, so if you update certain parts of the correctors, and this was really not a high percentage that we had to update, you can improve, especially in this target regime of mesh sizes here, you can improve your error quite a lot. And this you can see for this target regime H, you can see this on the right-hand side as well, where we fixed H as 2 to the minus 4. And then for over some iterations, plotted the relative the evolution of the relative energy error. You see stagnates on a high quite early. Then this LOD infinity, so with a fixed multiscale space, it goes down for some iterations, but then it also reaches a plateau. And the adaptive variant goes down even further and then slowly reaches the plateau of the discretization error. So let me briefly, with respect to time, let me briefly sum up. We methods for nonlinear problems that work beyond assumptions of periodicity and scale separation. It was important that we had a linearized and localized generation of a problem-adapted basis in both parts of this talk. In the first part, we looked at an a priori linearization. In the second part, we looked at an adaptive iteration. And in both parts, again, we obtained error estimates with respect to mesh size, with respect to the mesh size, up to some quantifiable linearization errors. And of course, these adaptive iterative multiscale methods are also interesting for other problem classes. So for the first part of this talk, for the quasi-linear problems, and also for other realistic nonlinear problems like quasi-linear waves, non-monotone problems such as Richard's equation, which could be studied in the future. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was exactly on time. Okay, so do we have any question from our participants, from our audience? Any question for Dr. Verfürth? Okay, there is some. So there is one question from Daniel. So how sharp is the a posteriori part of the error bound in practice?
Yeah, thanks for the question. In practice, how sharp it is, yeah, this is really an important question, and I cannot answer it fully because our experience is quite limited in this sense. So you cannot theoretically show that these error estimators are efficient in some sense, so that they also from below bound the error. But in practical applications, as we had here, and as these a posteriori error indicators were already in a similar fashion used in other applications, they seem to at least qualitatively indicate regions where you need to update very well. So it gives you, it's not in a quantitative sense that if that it shows you it's 10, that it means that your error is of an order 10 or anything, but qualitatively, like differentiating which regions are problematic and which are not so, which are easy, where you can neglect this. And in this case, they are very, very well and very sharp, but I don't know. Yeah, I think that theoretical underpinning of these observations is still needs some more work, I guess.
Okay. So, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So, any other question for Dr. Verfürth? Okay, so thank you very much for your very nice presentation, nice talk. So,
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity and thanks for listening.